Hello everyone, and welcome to Secrets in the Shadows. My name is William, and today we're going to explore a story that is both heartbreaking and shocking. Before we begin, I want to say that viewer discretion is advised. Some of the details may be disturbing and not suitable for all audiences. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, you can pause or step away. If you find this work meaningful or helpful in understanding these complex stories, please consider subscribing to this channel and turning on notifications. Your support helps us continue uncovering and sharing these important cases with you. Today's story is about the disappearance of Susan Powell, a young mother from Utah who vanished under very suspicious circumstances in December 2009. This case is tragic on many levels, layered with mystery, heartbreak, and unanswered questions. It still haunts people who knew her and those who have studied it. I will guide you through everything we know: her background, her marriage, her family life, the strange behavior of her husband Josh, the heart-wrenching events that followed, and the ongoing search for justice and closure. We'll take this slowly and carefully, step by step, so that everyone can understand. I'll share what investigators discovered, what the media reported, what her family has said, and my own reflections. We must treat Susan and her loved ones with respect. She was a real person, a loving mother, daughter, and friend. Her two young sons, Charlie and Braden, were innocent, full of life, and deserved a future free from harm. Let's keep them all in our hearts as we try to make sense of what happened. If you're new here, Secrets in the Shadows is a channel dedicated to exploring cases that remain unsolved, misunderstood, or hidden in mystery. Stories like Susan's matter because they remind us that real people are affected, and sometimes the justice system struggles to protect the innocent. Settle in, and let's begin. Susan Cox Powell was born on October 16, 1981, in Alamogordo, New Mexico. She grew up in a caring family that eventually settled in the Pacific Northwest. Susan was described as kind, generous, and nurturing. She had a bright smile and cared deeply for others. Her faith and community were important to her, and she dreamt of a stable, happy family life. In her early 20s, Susan met Josh Powell at an LDS church event. They began dating, and in 2001, they married in the Portland, Oregon LDS temple. At first, it looked like the start of a beautiful life together. They eventually moved to Utah, planning to build a future there. However, as we'll see, not everything was as it seemed. Marriage is complex, and those closest to Susan began noticing problems that would eventually loom too large to ignore. As we step into Susan and Josh Powell's domestic life, we need to understand the foundation they attempted to build: their everyday routines, their hopes and dreams, and the cracks that gradually spread beneath the surface. On paper, they appeared like many young couples, newly married, raising children, juggling finances, and striving for stability. But it was what lay behind closed doors that truly shaped the fate of this family. Let's start with their move to Utah. After marrying in the Portland, Oregon LDS temple in 2001, the couple relocated a few times, eventually settling in West Valley City, Utah. They were part of a close-knit community, many of whom belonged to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Susan, who had been raised with strong values of faith, kindness, and responsibility, found comfort in having friends and neighbors who shared her beliefs. She involved herself in church activities, enjoyed gatherings with neighbors, and volunteered for community events. Her faith was a source of strength, something she leaned on as life became more complicated. By the time they were in Utah, Susan and Josh had welcomed two sons into the world: Charlie in 2005 and Braden in 2007. Susan cherished motherhood. She was known to be a gentle, patient parent who found joy in the small moments, reading bedtime stories, playing in the backyard, and encouraging the boys to explore the world around them. If you had visited the Powell home on a typical afternoon, you might have found Susan on the floor, assembling puzzles with the boys, singing songs, or teaching them simple lessons about kindness and sharing. In contrast, Josh's role within the family seemed more distant and complicated. Initially, he showed moments of warmth. He wasn't always cold or indifferent. In the early years, he tried to be a provider, but he struggled with keeping steady employment, drifting in and out of job opportunities without truly settling into a career path. Bills piled up and finances became a constant worry. Susan, ever resourceful, clipped coupons, scoured for sales, and managed their household budget to ensure the mortgage and utilities were paid and that their pantry was stocked with affordable, decent meals. There were also subtle signs of tension over decision-making and control. Friends and family would later recall that Josh liked to be in charge of money, of activities, and of the family's daily schedule. He showed little flexibility, and over time, Susan found herself walking on eggshells, trying to keep peace and maintain some sense of normalcy. Inside their modest home, you might not have immediately sensed turmoil. Susan's touches were everywhere. Family photos on the wall, children's drawings on the fridge, fresh flowers picked from a neighbor's garden. She created an atmosphere that felt safe and comforting for her boys. But if you spent more than a few hours there, you might notice Josh's standoffish demeanor. He often retreated to his computer or his own projects, showing little interest in everyday family activities. It wasn't that he never interacted with the children, he did, but the warmth and easy affection that Susan radiated were harder to find in him. Financial strain magnified their differences. Susan worked hard, sometimes outside the home, to help cover expenses. At times, she worked for companies that offered benefits, something she knew the family needed. While she was busy trying to ensure their economic survival, Josh seemed more absorbed in his own world. Susan wrote in her personal journals about the frustration of it all, how she felt increasingly trapped by their circumstances and by Josh's behavior. If Susan tried to talk to Josh about money, about seeking help from family, or about finding a more stable job, he often brushed her off or grew defensive. After some arguments, Susan would retreat, hoping he'd come around on his own if given enough space. Meanwhile, she did her best to shield Charlie and Braden from any tension. The boys were her priority. They were lively, curious children. Charlie loved to ask questions and learn new words, while Braden giggled at silly games and enjoyed following his older brother around. When visitors came, Susan greeted them warmly, offering coffee, tea, or a snack, and proudly showing them the children's latest drawings. Josh, however, might appear briefly before wandering off, muttering about a project he had to finish or a task he needed to complete. He rarely engaged in deeper conversations with friends or family. Over time, many of those who knew them got the sense that Susan carried the emotional weight of the household on her own. Another strain was the involvement of Josh's father, Steve Powell. While at this stage, Susan might not have fully understood the depth of Steve's inappropriate obsession with her, his presence and influence over Josh were unsettling. Steve had a strong personality, and it seemed he encouraged some of Josh's more controlling tendencies. Though Susan wanted to maintain family ties, believing in the importance of in-laws and grandparents for her children, she felt increasingly uncomfortable around Steve. His unsettling comments and the way he looked at her made Susan's skin crawl. Yet she tried to keep the peace, telling herself that family was family, and maybe things would improve over time. Behind her warm smile, Susan wrestled with growing fears and doubts. She recorded her worries in letters and journals, tucking them away for safekeeping. She wrote about feeling isolated, about her love for her children, and her hope that someday Josh might become more of the partner she'd always envisioned. She wanted a life free from the underlying tension, one where she and Josh worked together as a team, where he would look at her not as someone to control, but as an equal partner. Friends who spent time with Susan noticed subtle changes. She became quieter about her relationship, no longer quick to defend Josh when someone pointed out something odd or concerning about him. On the surface, she still laughed at social gatherings, still brought the kids out to play dates, and still maintained her faith community commitments. But underneath, she was taking mental notes, small but worrisome incidents, arguments about where the money went, Josh's resistance to guidance or help, and his strange detachment from the family's emotional core. She tried to compensate by providing what stability she could for Charlie and Braden. She read parenting books, joined mothers' groups, and ensured the boys had routines, regular bedtime stories, trips to the park, consistent church attendance, and simple family traditions, like making holiday decorations together. Susan was building a foundation of love and normalcy that she hoped would sustain her children, no matter what challenges lay ahead. It's important to emphasize that Susan did not present herself as a victim to the outside world. She was strong-willed and intelligent, but she was also patient and kind, and gave Josh far more chances than many others might have. She believed in the sanctity of marriage and hoped that by showing love, understanding, and resourcefulness, she could guide Josh toward being a better husband and father. In many ways, Susan's virtues, her patience, kindness, and willingness to see the best in others were the very qualities that may have kept her in a troubled situation longer than she should have been. In this environment, tense yet not explosively so, loving in many ways yet clouded by increasing distrust, everyday life marched on. The family went to church on Sundays. Neighbors saw them at community gatherings, and the children laughed in their backyard sandbox. Yet, beneath that veneer of normalcy, a ticking clock was counting down to a tragedy no one could have imagined. Susan's intuitive fears, the journal entries, the carefully clipped coupons, and the forced smiles all now seem like puzzle pieces that point toward a darker reality hidden just beneath the surface of the Powell family's daily life. As we move forward, keep in mind the weight Susan carried. She held on to the hope that things could still change. Sadly, the world now knows that they didn't. But understanding the inner workings of the Powell family home helps us see how events later unfolded. Susan's struggle for stability, Josh's strange detachment, and the shadow of Steve Powell's influence all set the stage for the heartbreaking events that would eventually command national attention. December 6, 2009, began like many other Sundays for the Powell family. That morning, Susan, Josh, Charlie, and Braden attended their regular church service. It was a routine they followed most weekends, a comforting tradition where Susan could connect with her faith community and give the boys a stable, familiar rhythm to their lives. Friends who saw them at church that day noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Susan looked a bit tired. She often did, given the financial stresses and constant effort to keep the household running smoothly, but nothing hinted at the tragedy that would soon unfold. After services, they returned home to their modest house in West Valley City, Utah. The weather outside was brisk as winter had settled in. Inside their home, the warmth of family life seemed to linger. Susan tried to keep Sundays peaceful. Often, after church, she might prepare a simple meal or spend quiet time with the boys, reading stories or watching them play with their toys on the living room floor. Even when tired, she made an effort to keep things feeling normal, especially for Charlie and Braden, who thrived on these family routines. At some point that afternoon, a neighbor stopped by. From all accounts, everything inside the Powell home seemed calm. Susan, though not brimming with energy, greeted the visitor kindly. She was polite, perhaps subdued, but not visibly alarmed or distressed. The children were their usual energetic selves, playing happily and soaking up the last bits of the weekend before a new week began. If you had walked into the Powell home at that moment, you might have thought it was just another quiet Sunday. A family resting, children laughing, and parents decompressing from the week. Yet, in retrospect, every detail from that day has taken on a painful weight. People who saw Susan would later replay their memories, wondering if they had missed a sign, a fleeting look, a choice of words, anything that might have indicated she was in danger. But at the time, her behavior didn't send up any red flags. She did not appear fearful or desperate. She didn't confide in anyone that day that she intended to leave or that something terrible was about to happen. On the surface, it was life as usual. There's a heartbreaking simplicity to how ordinary that Sunday seemed. Susan might have done a few household chores, folding laundry, and tidying up after the boys. Maybe she checked her email or skimmed through grocery ads, planning the week ahead. She may have jotted down a few thoughts in her personal journal or said a small prayer for strength and guidance, as she often did. Outside, neighbors carried on with their own lives. Some put up holiday decorations, others visited friends, completely unaware that history was quietly pivoting toward darkness behind those Powell doors. As evening approached, the winter daylight faded early. The family likely settled in for dinner. Something simple, maybe leftovers, or a quick meal Susan could prepare without fuss. In a home affected by financial strain, Susan was adept at making the most of what they had. Dinner may have been accompanied by the children's chatter, Charlie talking about something he'd learned in church, Braden giggling at his brother's antics. Josh, ever distant, might have been present physically but absent in spirit, absorbed in his own thoughts or tasks. The night passed without public incident. If an argument happened, it wasn't overheard by neighbors. If Susan had a moment of dread, she didn't voice it to anyone outside the home. When she tucked her boys into bed, if she did the usual story time and bedtime routine, it likely felt as normal as any other night. One can imagine her bending down to kiss each son's forehead, whispering reassuring words, and promising another day of love and care when they woke up. This ordinary calm is what makes the next morning's events so chilling. Because by the time dawn broke on December 7th, Susan would have vanished. She wouldn't show up at her job that day, wouldn't drop off the boys at daycare, and wouldn't answer her phone. Her belongings, purse, keys, cell phone, would remain inside the house, as if she'd simply stepped out and never returned. It's as though she vanished into thin air during the quiet stretch of the night. A night that began just like any other Sunday evening in the Powell family home. This final day, this last, seemingly uneventful Sunday, serves as a haunting reminder of how quickly normalcy can collapse. It highlights the troubling truth that tragedy often arrives with no warning, no dramatic prelude to alert onlookers. Instead, it slips in between the cracks of daily life, leaving those left behind to sift through the memory of a quiet afternoon and wonder, what if someone had known? Could anyone have intervened? In the next section, we'll examine the initial investigation that began once everyone realized Susan was gone, and how the details of this last normal day would be scrutinized for any clue, any hint of what might have happened in those final hours when Susan Powell was still seen, still alive, and still just trying her best to keep her family going. The morning of December 7th, 2009, brought an unsettling quiet. Susan Powell did not show up at her workplace. Charlie and Braden did not appear at their daycare, which was highly unusual. Friends and coworkers tried calling Susan, but their calls went straight to voicemail. People who knew her were growing uneasy. Susan was responsible and dependable. She wouldn't simply vanish without a word. When no one could reach her, the authorities were contacted. Officers from the West Valley City Police Department arrived at the Powell home later that day. They found the front door locked. Inside, the lights were off, and the house was eerily still. Upon entry, it became immediately clear something was amiss. Susan's purse, wallet, identification, keys, and cell phone were all in plain sight, left behind as though she had stepped out for just a moment and never returned. This scenario clashed violently with the idea of Susan leaving voluntarily. If she had run away or embarked on some unexpected journey, why abandon all the essentials that would sustain her? Adding to the confusion, Josh and the boys were nowhere to be found. But as the day stretched on, Josh returned with Charlie and Braden in tow, claiming he'd taken them on a spontaneous late-night camping trip out in the desert. Even as snow fell, temperatures plummeted, and darkness wrapped around the Utah wilderness. The police found this explanation implausible. Who would choose that time, that weather, and that setting to camp with two very young children? Officers took careful note of Josh's demeanor. He appeared nervous, yet oddly detached. Rather than expressing desperate concern for his missing wife, he seemed preoccupied with defending his strange decision to go camping. Investigators asked straightforward questions. What time did he leave the house? Where exactly did he set up camp? Had Susan said anything before he left? Josh's responses were vague and evasive. Instead of the anguished husband one might expect, he came across as guarded and oddly unconcerned. Inside the home, forensic investigators searched for clues. They found a few small but significant details. For instance, there were subtle signs that someone may have cleaned up recently, spots of wetness that seemed out of place, particularly in frigid winter weather. More disturbingly, they discovered traces of Susan's blood on a couch and the floor. It wasn't a large amount, but enough to raise serious questions. There was no justification for Susan's blood to be present like that, especially without an explanation for why she was gone. They also discovered documents revealing that Susan had a substantial life insurance policy. While not suspicious on its own, many couples carry life insurance. Combined with her disappearance, it added another layer of complexity. Susan had also written about her fears in personal letters and journals. She expressed concern for her own safety, indicating that if something happened to her, it would not be by accident. Her words felt like a haunting echo from the past, a warning she'd tried to leave behind. As investigators pieced together these early clues, the media picked up on the story. Neighbors and church friends were in shock. Susan was beloved in her community, known as kind, hardworking, and devoted to her children. The idea that she would leave them was unthinkable. Everyone waited anxiously for a breakthrough, some sign that the police knew more than they were letting on. But at that time, all they had were baffling contradictions and a husband whose behavior made little sense. As days turned into weeks, the community and the media focused on Josh Powell's actions, both before and after Susan's disappearance. The more people learned, the more troubled they felt. This wasn't a straightforward case. There was no definitive piece of evidence screaming guilty, but Josh's behavior seemed to roil with red flags. For one, he was unhelpful from the start. In many missing person cases, we see frantic spouses begging for help, joining search parties, and reaching out to the public. Josh did none of that. He offered no tearful pleas, no heartfelt interviews asking for Susan's safe return. Instead, he lawyered up quickly, avoiding direct interactions with detectives whenever possible. While it's within one's rights to have legal counsel, the emotional tone, cold, detached, and dismissive, was unsettling. Then there were his actions following Susan's disappearance. Financial records showed that after Susan vanished, Josh accessed and drained her retirement accounts. He also canceled her standing medical appointments, as if he already knew she would never need them again. These steps implied a sense of permanence about Susan's absence that no innocent spouse would so readily accept. Rather than maintaining hope, he appeared to have already moved on. The police, suspecting Josh, searched the family's computers for digital footprints, emails, browsing histories, anything that might provide insight. While no smoking gun emerged, the pattern was that of a man living in his own bubble, concerned more with self-preservation than the fate of his wife. He refused to take a polygraph test. He wouldn't clarify his meandering alibi for the night Susan vanished. His explanations for crucial timelines shifted slightly under scrutiny. Meanwhile, investigators and Susan's loved ones began learning more about the Powell family dynamic, and it cast Josh in an even darker light. His father, Steve Powell, emerged as a disturbing figure. Steve was found to have a twisted obsession with Susan. He recorded her secretly, wrote extensively about his fantasies involving her, and kept a cache of inappropriate materials that would later lead to his own arrest. While none of this directly solved Susan's disappearance, it revealed the toxic environment Josh had grown up in, and possibly gave him a warped view of relationships and boundaries. Knowing that Susan had struggled financially and emotionally in the marriage added to the suspicion. She managed their finances, worked hard to provide stability for the children, and confided in friends about her marital troubles. She wrote letters expressing fear for her life. Josh's actions were not those of a desperate man trying to locate his beloved partner, but those of someone who treated her disappearance as an inconvenience at best, and a problem to be managed at worst. The police considered Josh a person of interest, but they didn't have enough to charge him. Without a body, without direct evidence linking him to a crime, their hands were tied. This lack of a definitive legal step frustrated Susan's family and the wider community. How could someone who behaved so suspiciously be allowed to walk free, taking the children wherever he pleased? The media's spotlight intensified. News anchors, talk shows, and internet sleuths all dissected Josh's every move. They wanted to understand what made him tick, why he seemed so unconcerned, why his story kept shifting in subtle ways, why he didn't seem compelled to clear his name in a straightforward, transparent manner. As time passed, Josh retreated further into himself. He took his sons out of state, moving to Washington to be closer to Steve. The police monitored him, but remained without the hard evidence needed to make an arrest. Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, grew more desperate for answers. They couldn't understand why Josh refused to help. If he was innocent, why not cooperate fully to prove it? If he truly cared about Susan, why wasn't he on his knees begging for any lead, any tip that could bring her home? These questions darkened the public perception of Josh Powell. He was no longer just an eccentric or troubled husband. He was now widely viewed as a man who likely knew exactly what happened to Susan and chose to hide it. While the investigation pressed on, both publicly and behind the scenes, everyone waited for a breakthrough. Every subtle hint, every piece of circumstantial evidence was scrutinized. But as the days turned into weeks, and then into months, no confession came, no body was found, and no concrete proof sealed Josh's fate. In the face of this unsettling uncertainty, a clear picture emerged of Josh's character. Secretive, detached, more preoccupied with controlling narratives and finances than finding his missing wife. This would not be the end of his story, nor the end of the heartbreak he would cause. But for now, investigators and the public could only watch, horrified and frustrated, as he calmly carried on, a man under a dark cloud of suspicion, yet free to shape the next terrible chapters of this unfolding tragedy. As weeks passed without any sign of Susan, the story spread beyond the quiet neighborhoods of West Valley City. Local news stations provided nightly updates, radio shows discussed the case on morning commutes, and online forums buzzed with theories. The mystery of a young mother vanishing so suddenly, leaving behind two small children, struck a deep chord with the public. People who had never met Susan felt personally invested. After all, this wasn't just a distant headline. It could have happened in their own community, to their own loved ones. Before long, national media outlets picked up the story, broadcasting Susan's smile and the few details known about her disappearance to millions of households. Interview segments featured friends who praised Susan's kindness and family members who fought back tears, pleading for her safe return. The coverage was relentless, yet humanizing. It brought Susan's face into our living rooms, making her absence impossible to ignore. People posted Susan's picture on social media, prayed for her at church gatherings, and organized candlelight vigils. Her name became a rallying cry for the desperate search for answers. In contrast, Josh's public image deteriorated with every passing day. News clips showed him dodging reporters' questions, declining interviews, or releasing carefully crafted statements through his lawyer. These controlled responses felt hollow against the backdrop of a grieving family and a community hungry for sincerity. Many viewers grew outraged. How could he not step forward, tears in his eyes, begging for any clue that might lead him to Susan's whereabouts? Pundits and online commentators didn't hold back their criticism. Talk shows debated the morality of Josh's silence. True crime enthusiasts scrutinized every detail of his story, dissecting his bizarre camping trip and scrutinizing his stony demeanor. In chat rooms and comment sections, people expressed anger, confusion, and frustration. They condemned what they saw as his lack of empathy and humanity. Throughout all this, Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, emerged as poignant figures. Their interviews revealed raw pain and unwavering determination. They were gentle souls, thrust into an unimaginable nightmare. Their voices cracked when they spoke of Susan's generosity, her love for her boys, and her faith. They never lashed out with hatred or threats. Instead, they stood as a testimony of grace under fire, begging Josh, publicly and privately, to simply tell them where Susan was. This intense media scrutiny was a double-edged sword. It kept Susan's case in the public eye, ensuring that law enforcement and the legal system felt pressure to keep investigating. Tips poured in from strangers who thought they'd seen a woman matching Susan's description or spotted suspicious activity in remote areas. Yet the coverage also meant that every small detail about the family, every past mistake or unusual preference, was brought into the light. It was a magnifying glass that sometimes blurred the line between fact and speculation. Still, the overriding sentiment was one of injustice and disbelief. How could Susan vanish without a trace? How could a husband fail to show heartbreak in his wife's absence? The constant media coverage reflected society's collective outrage and disbelief, driving home the unsettling truth that we were witnessing a family tragedy unfolding in real time, with no resolution in sight. The months following Susan's disappearance were marked by fear, uncertainty, and growing suspicion. Yet nothing could have prepared the world for what happened on February 5, 2012, more than 2 years after Susan vanished. By this time, child welfare authorities and the courts had grown increasingly concerned about Charlie and Braden's safety. The boys were showing subtle signs that they had witnessed or knew something troubling. They made odd comments, drew strange pictures, and occasionally let slip unsettling remarks that hinted at trauma. This was enough for a judge to grant temporary custody of the boys to Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy, while Josh was restricted to supervised visitation. It was a small victory for those who believed that keeping the children away from Josh was the safest option. On that cold February afternoon, a social worker brought Charlie and Braden to Josh's rented home for a court-approved supervised visit. Within moments of the boys entering, Josh slammed the door, locking the social worker outside. Panicked, she pounded on the door, screaming for him to let her in. She dialed 911, desperately trying to convey the gravity of the situation. But what happened next was unimaginable. An explosion ripped through the house, followed by a fierce, consuming fire. By the time firefighters arrived, the home was an inferno. Inside, they found the bodies of Josh, Charlie, and Braden. Josh had taken his life and the lives of his innocent children in a final, horrific act of violence. He had also left voicemails and emails to friends and family moments before, calmly stating that he could not live without his sons. It was a chilling, monstrous decision, and it left everyone shaken to their core. When news of the tragedy broke, the public reeled. Shock and sorrow washed over those who had followed the case. The senselessness of killing 2 young boys, who had done nothing but love their parents, was beyond comprehension. People wept openly at the thought of Charlie and Braden's last moments, trapped in a nightmare orchestrated by their own father. For Chuck and Judy Cox, the heartbreak was immeasurable. They had lost their daughter to a mystery, and now their beloved grandsons were gone too. It was as if cruelty had no limit. This violent, fiery end felt like an unforgivable injustice. The turn the case had taken was darker than anyone had imagined, snuffing out the only living connections to Susan that might have led to the truth. The world was left grappling with the enormity of Josh's final act. Many asked, had the system failed these children? Could more have been done to protect them? The heartbreak was total, and the bitterness of Josh's last choice would linger for years to come. In the wake of the explosion and the deaths of Charlie and Braden, the community and the nation mourned. Vigils were held, flowers and toys piled up at makeshift memorials, and people lit candles in the cold night air to remember the 2 boys who had never had a chance to grow up. There was a profound sense of loss, a collective heartbreak that enveloped everyone who cared about Susan's family, whether they knew them personally or not. As the tragedy settled into the public consciousness, the most pressing question remained. Where was Susan? Her body had never been found, and now the one person who likely knew the truth was gone. Josh had taken that secret with him. Investigators redoubled their efforts, following any tip, re-examining old evidence, and combing through the desert and mountainous terrains of Utah. They searched abandoned mines, scoured data from Josh's digital footprint, and even brought in specialized equipment to probe remote areas. But every lead turned into a dead end. Chuck and Judy Cox, despite their unimaginable grief, refused to give up. They continued to push for answers, though the obstacles seemed insurmountable. They spoke gently about Susan whenever they could, making sure people remembered her not as a missing person, but as a loving mother, a daughter who brought joy to their lives. They were committed to keeping her memory alive and maintaining hope, however slim, that someday her remains would be discovered and laid to rest with dignity. Over the years, various searches and leads emerged. Volunteers organized expeditions, scanning remote locations, following theories that Susan's body could have been hidden in a mine shaft or buried in an out-of-the-way canyon. Law enforcement never officially closed the case. They encouraged the public to remain vigilant, to report anything suspicious, no matter how small. This persistence was a testament to Susan's enduring impact and the shared desire for justice. Yet, as time passed, the likelihood of finding her diminished. The landscape was vast and unforgiving. Clues that might have existed were washed away by time, weather, and the erasure of memory. It was a cruel reality. The person responsible for Susan's disappearance had also robbed the world of the best chance to understand what happened that December night in 2009. But still, people remembered. Online communities remained active, discussing new angles, analyzing old evidence with fresh eyes, and refusing to let Susan's name fade into obscurity. She had become a symbol of a case that, though unresolved, underscored the vulnerability of victims trapped in abusive relationships and the failings of a system unable to prevent unfathomable tragedies. The Susan Powell case, with all its lingering questions and harrowing losses, left a mark on everyone who encountered it. We remember Susan not just as a missing woman, but as a vibrant, loving mother who deserved safety and happiness. We remember Charlie and Braden, two bright little souls caught in a tragic family storm. Their deaths shook us to our core, reminding us that in some cases, existing safeguards fail, and that we must do better. This case has been a catalyst for conversations about domestic violence, mental health, and the failings of child protective systems. People have pushed for stricter laws to protect children when a parent is under suspicion of serious wrongdoing. Advocates and lawmakers have debated new policies to ensure children's voices and well-being are given the highest priority. Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, have worked tirelessly in their daughter's memory. Despite their immense grief, they've fought for reforms to prevent other families from experiencing similar horrors. They've stood as advocates for those who cannot speak for themselves, honoring Susan, Charlie, and Braden by trying to make the world safer for vulnerable families. Today, the legacy of the Powell case lives on in each person who remembers Susan's name and her story. It lives in the quiet moments of reflection, in the steady efforts to improve laws and procedures, and in the compassionate hearts of strangers who refuse to let this family's suffering be in vain. Over the years, the search for Susan continues, if not actively on foot, then in spirit, her memory guiding people to ask hard questions and demand better protection. The case has become a touchstone, a reminder that behind every headline is a real person with dreams, a life story, and loved ones left behind. In remembering Susan, we vow to look for warning signs, to take concerns seriously, and to never forget that what may seem like a private matter within a family can, in fact, be a matter of life and death. Though the mystery remains unsolved, Susan Powell's story, and the story of her sons, endures as a call to action. We must remain vigilant, kind, and determined to prevent another tragedy like this from happening. The lessons learned continue to ripple outward, reminding us to value human life, seek truth, and hold those responsible for harm accountable, even when the path to justice feels impossibly long. We've journeyed through the tragedy and mystery surrounding Susan Powell, her disappearance, the heartbreaking loss of her children, and the lingering questions that remain. It's a story that reminds us how fragile life can be and how deeply family and community are affected by unanswered injustices. I want to thank you sincerely for watching and for caring about this case. By remembering Susan, Charlie, and Braden, we keep their memory alive and acknowledge that we must continue striving for better protection and greater understanding to prevent such tragedies from happening again. If you found this exploration meaningful, please consider subscribing to Secrets in the Shadows. Your support allows us to continue bringing attention to important cases, sharing untold stories, and seeking truth and healing. Once again, thank you. Your time, empathy, and willingness to understand these stories truly matter. Until next time, this is William, wishing you and your loved ones peace, safety, and hope for a brighter future.